Well, good evening and welcome to the Holocaust Memorial and Tolerance Center's program with Leah Garrett about her new book, X Troop. My name is Thorin Tritter. I'm the Museum and Programming Director at the Holocaust Memorial and Tolerance Center, which is located in Glen Cove, New York. I'm really particularly excited about our program this evening. Professor Garrett, who is the director of the Jewish Studies program at Hunter College, has just come out with this really terrific book about a secret group of Jewish commandos who served under the British Army during World War II. And we'll get more into that in a minute. Before we do that, I do want to just take the opportunity to share some other upcoming programs with you and put in an advertisement for your attendance at these programs. So tomorrow at 11 o'clock, I'm holding the next in my Curator's Corner series where I look at a particular object or image in our museum and try and talk a little about its context and importance. I'm going to be speaking tomorrow about a photograph that we have that shows a Jewish storefront in Frankfurt as it was going through the Aryanization process, and it was under forced sale to non-Jews in Frankfurt in 1938. I'm going to also want to let you know about our fashion show and luncheon that's coming up on next Wednesday, September 22nd at the Pine Hollow Club here on Long Island. I hope you'll join us for that event, which will be in person. It should be a lovely afternoon. It will be outdoors under a tent, so hopefully easing some concerns about COVID issues. We will ask everybody to prove their vaccination in advance of coming into the tent. But anyway, I hope you'll join us. Should be a lovely afternoon. And of course, you'd also be supporting our public programs and our educational programs from HMTC. One more program to mention. On Sunday, September 26th, we will be holding the next session in our monthly Sunday with Survivor series. And in this case, we are going to have the Holocaust survivor, Anita Weisbord, giving her testimony on that Sunday. She's going to talk about growing up in Vienna and then her experiences as part of the Kindertransport. You can find details about all of these events and all our upcoming programs, along with how to buy tickets to our fashion show and luncheon on our website at www.hmtcli.org, and then click the events tab. Okay, enough advertisements. Let me pull that down and let me give a more formal introduction to our guest this evening, Professor Leah Garrett. Professor Garrett is originally from New York, but her academic career has included a Fulbright Fellowship in Israel, studying at Oxford in England, teaching at the University of Denver out in Denver, and then in her most recent position before becoming the inaugural director of Jewish Studies at Hunter College, she was the Lotai Smorgon Research Professor of Contemporary Jewish Life and Culture at Monash University in Australia, a fair trek away. X Troop is her fourth book in Jewish Studies and comes on the heels of a widely acclaimed book entitled Young Lions, How Jewish Authors Reinvented the American War Novel, which won a number of awards and was shortlisted for the National Jewish Book Award. Given the response to X Troop, maybe more awards are in the offing. I like the way Deborah Lipstadt described your book, Professor Garrett. She wrote, as you know, that the book was part history and part mystery. X Troop, she says, tells a compelling and little-known story about an improbable group of British, she puts in quotes, soldiers who made an important contribution to the war effort. We'll get in a minute to the history and mystery, but for those of you out there who've read the book, you also know that Deborah Lipstadt is somewhat teasing us with her description. Compelling, for instance, I would say, does not do justice to this page turner of a book. Really, Professor Garrett makes this history come alive with really personal details about the commandos she describes. And similarly, to say that these men made an important contribution is only to scratch the surface of what Leah Garrett shares with us. But again, I will let Professor Garrett tell us more about this. One more comment before we get into this, which is to just encourage you out there in the audience to please, if you have questions for Professor Garrett, use the Q&A function of Zoom, type them in, and we'll make sure that Professor Garrett gets a chance to respond to them. Okay, enough of me talking. Let's get to our program. I'm delighted to introduce Professor Leah Garrett and welcome you to our virtual stage. Thanks very much for doing this.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm delighted to be here tonight.
You know, I think I've hinted at the content or given a touch of the content through Deborah Lipstadt's comment and my own, but I always like in our book programs to ask the author, what's your elevator speech? What's your kind of summary of the book? How do you describe it?
Well, you know, a few years back, I heard these rumors about the secret commando unit, and I started to investigate it. And I had this moment that everyone dreams of, who's a historian, where I was looking for the book about the commando unit. And I thought, oh my God, I get to be lucky enough to write this book, because when I talk about them and when hopefully the audience reads the book, I think they're going to feel like their head's going to explode, that people don't know about this story. So just very briefly, and then we can go into any details that are of interest to you. In 1942, the Allies were really struggling against the Germans, particularly the British. And Churchill, working with Lord Mountbatten, decided that they needed to do something really radical to win the war, whatever it would take at this point. So what they decided to do in 1942 was create a secret commando unit of German speakers. And the idea with these German speakers would be that they'd be really unusual and very different from like the American version, which is the Ritchie boys. The Ritchie boys were counterintelligence officers. These guys would be both counterintelligence officers and commandos. And the idea was that when these guys encountered the Germans on the battlefield, as commandos, they would capture and kill them. But as counterintelligence officers, because they had this German language, they would also interrogate them on the battlefield and get crucial information for what to do that next minute, days, hours, everything that they needed. There was nothing that had existed like this before. And of course, because they were looking for German speakers, and this wasn't intentional, but the reality was that the German speakers who they ended up finding for the commando unit were 95% Jews. And nearly every member of the commando unit was a German Jewish exile or an Austrian Jewish exile who had come to the UK, almost all of them on kinder transport as teenagers. Their parents had that impossible decision to save their kids' lives by letting go of them and putting them on these trains. And I'll talk in more detail however you want me to, but these were the guys who would end up comprising X-Troop. And what was really incredible about writing these stories is as I wrote each chapter, and they were in all the major campaigns of World War II, they were totally crucial to the Allied success. Like each chapter, I thought, my God, this is like a book. Like this should not just be a chapter, but they were there at the forefront of every battle. And in fact, it quickly became apparent to the British military that these guys were so awesome that they would parcel them out. So they never fought as their own unit. And the idea was that they were so invaluable that they would put them in 2s and 3s with other existing commando units, because these guys would be the tip of the spear. And they were the tip of the spear. And the reason that they were the tip of the spear is that for every single commando of the X-Troop, the war was personal. The clock was ticking. They knew they had to beat the Nazis if they had any chance of rescuing any family members who, God willing, were still alive somewhere in Europe. So it was deeply personal too. So that's sort of in short who they were and why they were so important. And final point is not only were they important in the war, but after the war, they were at the center of the denazification efforts after the war too.
You know, I had originally thought we would get to this later, but you've talked about how important they were to the war effort, and that comes across so clearly in your book. And I wondered if there's one or two examples that you would share with us about where really these commandos who we know before this, we knew so little about, what shows that they were significant to the war effort.
Okay, so there's multiple crazy stories in this book, all true. Like I did so much archival research to get this story out, and I can talk about that process too, if you're interested. And also for me, the clock was ticking too, because I knew that there were still 2 commandos alive when I wrote the book, and I needed to interview them for the book. So all of it was done in this sort of frenzied state. And one of the many extraordinary aspects of the X Troop is that when all of them were selected, the British military immediately realized that if any of them were captured, they would be killed as Jews, as Germans, as commandos, and so on and so forth. So after they were selected, they were all given about 10 minutes to come up with a new British persona. So all of the men who were fighting as X Troop had to pretend that they weren't Jewish. They all had to take on very British sounding names, and they wore Church of England dog tags. So if they were killed, they would be buried under crosses, but some of that has changed recently. Some of them have been reinterred under Stars of David. So a lot of when I talk about the story, it'll sound a little strange when I mention their names because some of the names will sound very British, but that's only because that was their fake persona that they had to use. So the story I start with, which I think is pretty typical and very phenomenal, is there was this one ex-trooper, like I said, everyone was from Germany and Austria. He was actually from Budapest, and he was just very athletic. He had been on the polo team in Budapest. He was from a Jewish family. He ends up taking the name George Lane when he becomes an ex-trooper. And in the days before the D-Day landings, he's selected to do, as they're always selected for these brave, crazy things. He is selected to land at night on the coast of Normandy to get intelligence on whether or not the Germans have developed new mines, because there was a rumor out that they had new mines. And if the mines were there and there was some kind of new thing, they couldn't do D-Day as planned. So they sent George Lane out on a little rubber dinghy to get a mine and bring it back. So he went there, he had these swimming skills. Again, for him, like everyone, the clock's ticking. He realizes that it's a standard German Teller mine. He goes back and he says, look, it's a standard mine. They send him out a second day, and he comes back a second day and says, I'm sure of it, you can do D-Day as planned. And they believe him now, right? But then they send him a third time because he's so incredible. He ends up getting captured. And I write about in the book because it was just such a crazy story. And they blindfold him and they take him, and he's captured with another commando, not an ex-trooper. And they take him to a castle, right? Because he's blindfolded, but he's looking out the side of the blindfold. They bring him into this room and they say to him, look, clean yourself up. You're about to meet someone really important. And so he's thinking, who can this be that I'm about to meet? Also, because again, he's very worried that they're going to pick up that he has a German accent. So he decides to put on a fake Welsh accent because he thinks it'll sound so strange. And it works. They bring him into this room and he has an interview with Field Marshal Rommel himself. And they talk about the war together. And Rommel wrote a letter about it. After this insane discussion in which George Lane talks about the treatment of the Jews, of course, hiding that he's a Budapest Jew and pretending to be a Welsh guy. When they drive him to the prisoner of war camp, because Rommel decides not to execute him, I think he was very charmed by him. He looks out the side of his blindfold. When he gets the prisoner of war camp, he goes to the fellow prisoners and he says, I have to tell you something crazy, this crazy story. They think he's a stooge, but eventually he tells them the whole story and they believe him. And they have a secret radio in the prisoner of war camp. They get the information back to London, and he tells them where Rommel's headquarters is. And then within a matter of weeks, Rommel's car is hit by bombers and he's out of the war. And after the war, I saw his military citation and it said, but for what George Lane did, we would not have done D-Day as planned. And that happens over and over again throughout my whole book, just over and over again.
It's really an incredible story, and highlights, as you say, the centrality of this one group of commandos. And what I think you said, there's like 80. How many of the guys are there?
There's 87, and they landed all the campaigns. They're on the first boat at Sicily, and they're really crucial in the Italian campaign. I mean, they're just everywhere, but particularly at the Normandy landings, and then moving their way across France and into Germany.
Now, you can't talk in great detail about all 80 of these guys, and so you focus on a couple of folks in particular in the book, but you really take us into their lives and into their accomplishments. And I just want to make sure I understand. When you say that George Lane was chosen and sent out on, it seems like a kind of a suicide mission, but he was not forced to go, right? He was in this. He wanted to be there.
Yeah, this happened over and over again. There's a great quote I put in the book by Peter Masters, who's one of the three I focus most intensely on. And he said, where other soldiers were drawing straws to see who got to stay back, we were drawing straws to see who got to do the most dangerous missions. Because again, it was so personal that they had to be at the front to do whatever it took to beat the Nazis, whatever it took. And they were highly ethical too. I can talk about that later. And they followed the rules of war, but for them, that clock was always ticking. So they had to act immediately and be braver than anybody else.
Yeah, even
they were relied on so much, so quickly, and were at the forefront of all these battles.
Yeah, and we'll come back to it maybe, but as you say, even though it's so personal to them, it's not like they get onto European soil or the continental soil and start just killing every German they can find. They are following the rules of war as much as they can. I want to just back up. I know there's some questions that have already come in and we'll get to them, but I just want to back up a step because there's a couple of important parts that we've jumped ahead of.
Yes.
One of them is, we've gotten to D-Day, but these guys, as you said, came mostly through the Kindertransport or all through the Kindertransport. How were they treated before the war? How were they treated in England?
Well, that's been one of the most surprising chapters in my book, was the treatment before they were chosen for X-Troop, because I tell a virtually unknown story here. So, okay, so like they're all young men, they're all sent alone, not all of them, but most of them are sent alone, 16, 15, 14, 17 years of age. They're all Holocaust survivors because they're all losing family members every day. They arrive, and at first, actually, when they're arriving in 1938, whatever it is, their treatment is actually pretty good. They're put in like big farms, or they're put in adoption centers or whatever, not to be adopted, but to be taken care of. They're given work. Different communities take care of them. But what ends up happening when the war breaks out is that this thing happens that people don't know about. A lot of British people don't know about. The book has been really broadly covered in the British press, and I think a lot of it has to do with this chapter. Is Winston Churchill infamously says, "Collar the lot." And what that meant was that when the war broke out, they decided that there might be a fifth column amongst their midst of Germans who would be enemies of the British state. So they decided to do a massive program of interviewing all the Germans and interning mostly those who were young single men, without a lot of thought about the idea that I think 85% of them were Jewish Holocaust survivors. And so virtually, in fact, every single ex-trooper who I write about in the book ends up getting interred in the years right after the war breaks out. Some of them interments, all of them interments are terrible. Those that are in the UK on the Isle of Man. And by the way, the book has tons of photos. So hopefully people will buy the book and see the
incredible. I mean, the fact that you have photos of these guys on their missions, it's
just great. I mean, so there's so many photos of this stuff, but I have photos of the internment camps. So if they were interned in the UK, it was okay. It was terrible. They were behind barbed wire, but they persevered. The more Orthodox amongst them found sort of Jewish communities. But a lot of them, and particularly those who end up being ex-troopers, end up getting sent overseas, either to Canada or to Australia. And it is absolutely horrific. It's called the Daenerys story. And they're put on the ship of the damned, basically, with an completely anti-Semitic British crew. And when I wrote the book, like I said, I was lucky enough to be able to interview two commandos. One of them had been on the Daenerys ship, and he talked to me, 96 years of age, shaking with rage as he talked about how the anti-Semitic crew had smashed glass on the deck and made all of these Jewish refugees run across it. They were treated like prisoners, and there were German prisoners of war there who were treated much better than the Jews, because they ended up all getting court-martialed, but the horrors they put these Jewish internees through. And then this whole group gets sent to Australia, to the outback. And I have a photo of the camp that they were sent to for a year. And they said that the hardest part about it was not being in the outback. It was that they didn't allow them to have newspapers. So they had no idea what was going on with their families at home. So all of these guys end up getting interred either in the UK or in Canada, which had horrific camps, or in Australia. And then what happens is the news gets out, particularly because of the Daenerys. Churchill stops this crazy thing. the guys are told, look, you can come out, but if you want to be in the military, you have to be in something called the Pioneer Corps, which is just a hard labor unit. They didn't get guns. And these guys were so frustrated because they wanted to fight the Nazis. So these guys all end up in the Pioneer Corps, and they start writing to their commanding officers and begging them, look, please, like put me in a normal unit. Some of them, like George Lane, sneaks out and gets in another unit. They figure out who he is. They send him back. Eventually, though, Churchill, Lord Mountbatten, working with MI5, decide to find the best and the brightest of these German speakers who are now all in the Pioneer Corps. And that's when they start interviewing them. And then they select them. And then they do yet another crazy thing. Not only do all of them have to now pretend to be British, but they send them all to Wales because their commanding officer, who is the most lovely, non-Jewish, father-like, extraordinary figure, Brian Hilton Jones, he's Welsh. So they spend a year living with Welsh villagers, pretending to, I mean, it's just crazy, like eating Welsh food and, interacting, not letting anyone know they're Jewish, until after a year of the most intense training that Brian Hilton Jones could possibly come up with in all aspects of counterintelligence and commando training. That's when they start to be pulled out to either go to Italy or to do the D-Day landings.
Yeah, so I may be mispronouncing it. Is it Aberdyfi? What's the name of this town?
It's so funny. I gave a talk in Wales about this with Zoom at the Wales University. I said, how do I say that to my friend who teaches? Apparently it's Aberdyfi, but it's Aberdovi was the old name of it. Now it's called Aberdyfi. And
this was this tiny little village.
Yes, this tiny
in
little
Wales,
village in
where
Wales.
they were doing their training away from everybody. Nobody knew what's going on, and the villagers didn't know. And you write about this, and it's amazing to think of this group of German Jews descending on this tiny little village, and trying to maintain the secret that they're not German Jews.
And it's amazing. Like, so I had this sort of BBC did an interview with a bunch of them right after the war, and these villagers, I have this really funny tape where they say that the ex-troopers were all saying, but we are English. And like the Welsh people thought something crazy is going on here, but they were different from the other soldiers because a lot of the commandos ended up being billeted in different places, right? So, but what the Welsh villagers kept saying over and over was these guys were so nice and they didn't drink and they were very quiet because the majority of them came from very cultured families, right? They were well-read, they were literate, they knew about music and art. And one of the people who ended up staying with them when they were in Wales was Miriam Rothschild, who I write a lot about in the book, because she was married to George Lane. And Miriam Rothschild, I have this great quote from her where she said, where other soldiers were talking about drinking, these boys were talking about Schopenhauer. Like they were different. But the training was extraordinary for all of them because of this, as they said, it made them really confident. That was the main thing. Like they learned how to put together and take apart guns. They learned how to do live ammunition. They were fired on, and had to evade bullets. They learned every aspect of the British military, and I have great photos of one of the guys who did the drawings of the stuff that they were learning. But the main thing was that they got confident. That's what, they learned that they weren't just these sort of cultured Jewish kids from Vienna, that they had the ability to, fight and capture and kill Germans too.
And you talk about also just the incredible physical fitness, right? I mean, they're just running up and down the hills of Wales and tromping on whatever 15, 20-mile hikes.
Climbing, jumping out of planes, everything. And what was great about Brian Hilton Jones, which was very unusual for the officer class at this time, was that he wouldn't make anyone do anything he didn't do himself first. So they loved him. They called him the skipper. And when I interviewed that surviving commando, but also when I went through all the archives I could find of all the commandos, the most coveted thing that they all had was the letter of recommendation that he wrote each of them after the war. I mean, I think my opinion is he became sort of the father figure to all of them. And I also write that the men were so much more than a band of brothers. They were brothers because they had all lost their real brothers. This became their new family unit.
One of the things that comes across as you write about in the section about the training in Wales is particularly on the heels of the mistreatment by the British government of these guys, that the folks, the villagers, the kind of the normal people of, at least in this town, they don't have that negative perception. Maybe, I mean, Maybe if they knew that they were Jews, maybe that would have been different. I don't know, but it's such a contrast as I read it, as I read it, to go from the kind of mistreatment, being sent to Australia, being mistreated like that, and then the villagers being welcoming and
Yeah,
seemingly pleased that these guys were there.
it's really interesting because to write the book, like I said, it was amazing because I found all these like official archives of the men, right? And then the Brits keep these thing called war diaries. So I had these war diaries. So whenever I had a story, I would validate it against a war diary to make sure it actually happened the way people remembered it. And then I also got in touch with all the families. So then I got these family archives as well. And it was really interesting that whenever I found, and a lot of these men, I got to interview 2 commandos, but a lot of them were interviewed after the war by different historians or by the Imperial War Museum or family interviews and stuff. So I had tons of material. And what they all said, honestly, over and over and over again to a man was not what I thought they would say, which was, I'm really angry about how the British treated me, because it's another, even after the war, these guys were not given naturalization papers. I mean, it's a bad story, but that's not what they focused on, these guys. What they focused on, every single one, was their gratitude actually to the Brits, that they gave them guns and said, go on, boys, fight, go do it. Here you go. We're going to train you. Now you go get your back, go right the world. So from an outsider, it looks to me like it sounds like a really tough story. And it is a tough story. I mean, I talk about how after the war, many of the commandos never reverted to their original names and they became like more British than the Brits, I think, because of the sense of maybe there was some anti-Semitism there. But overall, the sense was a sense of gratitude that they got to go out and fight. And the book is really, I don't know if you'd agree, but very optimistic, because it's like, we never get to hear these stories of Jews fighting back, and here you go. Jews are fighting back.
Let's get into that, because that's obviously a huge part of what the takeaway from this book is. We have this image all too often, and we know it's false. I mean, but the image is out there of Jews as kind of passive victims of the Holocaust.
Right.
And yet you're telling us here about not uprisings and resistance in controlled Europe, not Nazi-occupied Europe, but here we've got this group of Jews who got out and yet choose to fight back.
And go back, yeah.
So tell us a little, was that on your mind as a centrally important part of this book? What is that? That's kind of the big message I took away. Is that what I should be getting?
Yeah, it was actually on my mind. I have to tell you, because my previous book was about American Jewish soldiers. And there's actually not been so much work on that stuff. And, my grandfather, Abraham Klein, served in World War II. My great uncles all served in World War II. And I have often felt that the story of Jews fighting back has been underreported, because what we tend to focus on, like with Schindler's List, is like the good Gentile who saves the Jews. Sure, that's great. But there was a lot of Jews in the American military and the British military and the Russian military who were actively fighting back. So it wasn't like, I didn't let it obscure the information I was getting from the archives, but it was something I really sensed when I told the narratives of the different men I focus on, was how important it was to them that they got to go do this and, rescue family members, do all these things to try and right the world after, the majority of them had these incredibly happy young childhoods until the rise of Nazism. And then it all just went to crap for them. And they were given this chance to try and fix it. And I do think
you're touching here on a couple of things that have come up in the question. So let me get to a couple of those. One person writes about, did they meet any of the Ritchie boys either during or after the war? The guys who trained at Camp Ritchie, is that down in Maryland, I think it was?
Yeah, I mean, the Ritchie boys were like Boy Scouts, honestly, compared to these guys, because the Ritchie boys were just counterintelligence. They were not trained as commandos. These guys were trained as the Ritchie boys in terms of counterintelligence, but more importantly, they were trained as commandos with guns and war. So the idea, like I said, was they would capture the Germans and then they would interrogate them on the battlefield. And can I just give you like how that would work? Because I think they never met the Ritchie boys. A typical example is someone I focus on a lot in the book called Montford Gonz, and his story is incredible. I have photos, and his family was so helpful in writing this book. He was raised in an Orthodox Jewish family in Germany. Really loving, warm, wonderful family, had a really nice childhood, again, until the rise of Nazism. His parents put him on a train, sent him over to the UK. because of his German skills, and also he's fiercely intelligent. When he's doing the training in Wales, they actually select him to go to Cambridge to do extra counterintelligence training. So by the time he lands at D-Day, he is ready. And he talked about this. He did a number of interviews after the war where he talked about how, again, this idea of confidence. But he was not only confident, he was like a Superman. He was incredibly capable. And every battle he's in my book, he's at the front and he's making a huge difference. But typical of what I mean about how these guys were unusual was when he lands at Normandy, his unit lands at Sword Beach. All of these guys end up landing at Sword Beach. His boat unfortunately lands a bit to the side, a little bit late. So by the time he lands, it's an absolute carnage on the beach. And he keeps remembering his training where he's told over and over again, get off the beach, you have to get off the beach. So he remembers that. He starts running up the beach. And unfortunately, like I said, all of these guys are put with existing commando units, right? So he's with like 3 other ex-troopers with this larger other commando unit. And half of them are wiped out on the beach. And Montford Gonz, and he's called Fred Gray during the war. That's the name he took on during the war. Members get off the beach. As he starts to run up the dunes, he sees like 25 Germans there. And he decides, this is it. Here I am, I'm gonna do this. He yells out to them in colloquial German, boys, you need to right now show me the way off the beach, right? So again, it's the German language, but he's holding his gun. That's the commando aspect. And he gets the Germans to lead him off the beach through the minefields. And it's Montford Gonz then who ends up rescuing the other half of the commando unit and getting them to safety. And then they start making their whole way through France. So that's sort of how it worked. It's like they're sent at the very front. And even when they're landing at Normandy, every night, you know, people are trying to sleep. Ex-troopers aren't sleeping. They're being sent on night patrols across enemy lines, you know, to have a look around, to get important documents, to capture Germans. Every night they're sent across the lines to gather up information. But because of their commando training, when they encounter the Germans, they're also going to capture them as well.
Yeah, I mean, that's another example that you give of just, you know, you wonder if D-Day, you know, if Sword Beach would have opened in the same way without, you know, without one of these ex-troopers there.
Yeah, exactly. And the British recognized it. That's why, you know, within like a week of the war starting, a week of the ex-troopers actually in different places, everyone is begging to get ex-troopers amongst their commando units.
One of the other person who wrote in a question asks about, was it strategic to have Jews in deep undercover positions, or was this just an inadvertently a way that perpetuated the pre-war impression of Jewish reticence to be forceful? So was it, how did that work out? Was this something planned?
No, it was not. It was actually never discussed even that they were Jewish. Like I read the ex-troop war diary that Brian Hilton Jones wrote after the war. And I read all the different war diaries, and it's never mentioned that they're Jewish. It's sort of, you know, we have to deal with the fact that they're Jewish. We'll give them fake names and we'll give them crosses to wear, but that's not what matters. What matters is that they're German speakers. But what quickly becomes apparent to the British military is the fact is that because they're Jews, they're going to fight harder than anyone else. Seriously, like they're not going to be like a German. They're going to be fighting like a Jew. So it's an inadvertent part of it, but it's absolutely central to their complete success. But like I said, though, part of the reason the story was never told was many of them kept their cover after the war. One of the commanders, the one I interviewed who was on the Danera, he never told anyone that as he told me, his parents disappeared without a trace during the Holocaust, that he was a German from a German family. He kept his cover his whole life. And in the book, I have to actually use a fake name for him because many of them after the war, you know, a number of them reverted back to being Jewish, like Montford Gonz, the Orthodox guy, he reverted back. The majority of those who emigrated to the United States, which I thought was really interesting, reverted back to their Jewishness and their old identities. The majority of them who stayed in the UK kept their British names, raised their kids as Church of England, and so on and so forth. And it's still a real deep wound for some of the families as like they decide whether or not their, you know, great uncle or great grandfather or grandfather should be now buried under a Star of David rather than a cross. So it's still a live question to many of the families.
And you say in the book, am I right here that you're thinking that the general level of anti-Semitism in England was a factor that led those who stayed in England to continue to hide their identity, their pre-war, their real identity?
I don't think it was overt, but I think it was subtle, and I think it was there. And since I've written the book, I've heard from I've gotten so many incredible emails from people, and the sense I get is that there was just a sense from people that, in America we can have a hyphenated identity a little bit. Like I'm an American Jew. I think the sense was there, either you're Brit or you're Jew. And these guys had fought for the British. They loved Britain because they'd given them a gun. And I get a sense that there was a feeling that they had to kind of pick, and that, I just found it strange, but interesting and basic to the story, that so many of them became, I was thinking, why did they keep their names? And I think it was the anti-Semitism, but it was also the fact that they became these new names, like whoever that new name was, this new British name, at the point at which they were becoming adults. It's like they're hitting 18, they're now pretending to be British, they have a new name. And I think for many of them, that's actually who they became. That was their adult identity, the guy who's like strong and he's intelligent and he fights back. And so I understand it too. Another reason I think that like the commando who is still alive, who interviewed when he talked about his parents being lost in the Holocaust, I think another really core reason, I don't know if the ex-troopers would have agreed with this, that they kept the new names, almost all of them kept the new names, was that old name was like associated with like their moms who they lost, when she waved goodbye on the train or wherever it was, and it was just too painful. So it's sort of like when Jews emigrate to Israel and they take on these new tough sort of names. I think that's what happened to many of the ex-troopers in the UK. But back to your original question, I do get a sense, I do find it striking, honestly, that the majority of those who come to the US are Jewish overtly and raise their kids Jewish, and the majority of those who stay there stay quiet about it.
And this feeds into another, I found a very powerful chapter right at the end of your book. You talk about a memorial that was created in Aberdyfi, in that village in Wales where they trained. Can you give us a little bit about what the controversy is there with that memorial?
Yeah, that's a real tough story. And it's still an ongoing story, that story about the memorial in Aberdyfi. And this book, fortunately, I think is pushing back about a lot of this. So, there was a really high mortality rate for the ex-troopers because they were given the most dangerous missions with their hands up. And so those who survived the war, like I said, the majority, kind of keep their new persona. And about 20 years ago, a group of the survivors decided that they would self-fund and create a memorial to the ex-troop, which was also called the 3 Troop, where they had trained in Wales. And I read all the archival sort of interchange between all of the ex-troopers about this memorial. And it was led by this British guy named Brian Grant, who, again, no one knew, he didn't talk about being Jewish, all that kind of stuff. And he made this decision as the head of the memorial committee that it would not mention that they were Jewish. And I read all the letters from the ex-troopers, and the reasons they came up with were troubling. Like, we don't want to bring up anti-Semitism, or people fought for different reasons, whatever. Like 95% of them were Jewish and they were fighting as Jews. And against him were Montford Gonz, that Orthodox Jewish guy who's huge in my book, this guy Peter Masters, who's huge in my book, Miriam Rothschild, she really wanted the word Jewish in it, and they lost. So the memorial in Aberdyfi is this beautiful black granite memorial that does not mention that they're Jewish. There's a plaque that the town council put nearby that talks about their multiple religions and doesn't mention that they're Jewish. And then there's been this wonderful Jewish vet in the UK named Martin Sugarman, who has been fighting the council for 20 years. And he still sends me the emails that he sends to the council saying, you guys have got to recognize who this troop were. And they keep saying, the case is closed. We're not going to do this. But he's also fighting to get other crosses turned to Stars of David as well, because this story is still alive and it's still important. But at this point, the memorial does not say Jewish. So, but it's kind of, it's sort of like, it makes sense though, when you think about, that a lot of them hid it, it was top secret. So that's where it stands now. And there's photos in my book about the memorial. Oh, so what Martin Sugarman has done, which I think is just, I think personally brilliant, is he hired a local Jewish sculptor who made this beautiful brass Star of David that he's now put at the bottom of the memorial. And he tells everybody when you go to Wales and you go to the memorial, bring Stars of David. So they sent me a recent photograph of it, and there's all these beautiful little Stars of David at the bottom. So
that is, well, that's at least
lovely.
a
Yeah.
nice story, but I have to say, you say it makes sense, but I found it a very difficult chapter to read.
Really difficult. Yeah.
The other thing that memorial, when I read about that, when I got to that chapter and I read about the memorial, and I mean, it wasn't only that, but that highlighted to me that this was not a completely unknown story before X Troop came out.
No, it wasn't. Right.
And in fact, I'm just going to read one of the comments that came in is from a woman named Esther, who says, about 25 years ago, I put together a program we called They Went Back to Fight, which included Peter Masters as one of our speakers at HMTC.
He's the best.
And she writes, would you like a photo of him at our podium? As
Yes,
I wasn't here 25 years ago.
I would love that, because I became quite close with his daughter and his kids, because they really helped me write the book, and his wife too.
And Esther goes on, she says, another panelist was this American spy, a German Jewish refugee, Fred Mayer. And she said, I did the post-Holocaust interview with Peter and Alice Masters for the USHMM. So it's a small world.
Tell her, well, I know that interview, like, that's amazing. Yes, that it is a small world. So that was the great book that was written about X Troop. Was Peter Masters wrote this wonderful autobiography called Striking Back, where he talked about his experiences and he compiled all this information. So that was a huge resource for me. And then his family was wonderful. They let me go through all of his archives and his study, and the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum has an archive to him as well.
So, but what I took away, well, actually, let me pose it as a question rather than you telling me what I think, which is, so there was some information obviously out there about it, his book, the memorial, but what did you see that was different about what you were putting together in this book?
So I felt like I had a really large task, actually, because I wanted to do two big things. I wanted to tell the full story of this commando unit, and to get this really crucial story out of not only Jews fighting back, but Jews making a really big difference in the Allied efforts. Part of why it's been so satisfying that this book has been so huge in the UK has because I want the British to know that there were these guys there in their battles who made all the difference for the British success. Like I felt personally like the World War II story was wrong if you didn't include these guys. So what I wanted to do was tell the big story of what these men did and tell like all 87 stories. But what I also wanted to do was made sure that I kept my focus on the fact that this was a Holocaust story too, right? And the way you tell Holocaust stories is you tell about Jews and their families. So I'm telling the big story of the commando unit, but I'm also then I focus on maybe deeply on like 8 of the men and really deeply on 3 of the men. And what I do in the book is I give you their entire narrative from like, one of the men I talk about is Colin Anson, who's raised in this loving family until his dad's taken to Dachau and murdered. And then little Colin is sent by himself in a kinder transport to the UK, and his dad is, so all of the stories had this kind of aspect to them. And then, so I wanted to make sure I covered both aspects, that I always feel it's important and that we don't do it enough. I'm sure your institute does this, but in general in history, we don't do it enough to remind people that the World War II and the Holocaust are intertwined. They're not separate events. So that was my other big thing, was to make sure I'm telling you both stories at the same time.
One of the things that came across to me, particularly as I read that part about the memorial, was you make it clear right on the cover, Jewish commandos,
right?
And I'm, obviously that's come out. I'm in these other books, but given that memorial story, it just seemed so important to me that you were making clear that this book and this larger story is about Jewish commandos. It's
a Jewish story. It's so interesting. When I've interviewed one of the men of one of the commandos in the UK, and his dad was a real tough guy in the book. And when I interviewed him, his son had spent his whole life in the military, lovely man. And I said to him, look, I have to ask you the thing I ask everybody when I write this book, and it's really hard, but like, do you know what happened to your grandparents? Do you know what happened to your dad, the ex-trooper's parents? And we were in this pub and he just burst into tears. And I just sat there quietly with him and he cried. And I realized like this, he hadn't really talked about this before. And then he told me about how he had found out that his grandparents had been taken to the Lodge ghetto, I think it was, and no one ever heard from them again. And later on in my conversation with him, I talked to him about the memorial, about not saying the word Jewish on it. And I said to him, like, what do you think about that? What would your dad have thought? And he said, my dad probably wouldn't have wanted us to say Jewish. Like his dad was one of those British guys who didn't talk about it. He told me his dad never talked about this stuff and he had to figure it out for himself. But he said, look, history tells a different story. And if you're honestly telling the story of this commando unit, the word Jewish has to be front and central because that's how they fought, because of that ticking clock. And one of the stories that if people get the book that they'll find in it is it's so intimate. What happens that one of the men who I write about actually, and I got his diary from the United States Memorial Museum, actually goes and rescues his parents. Like it's extraordinary. And another guy.
This is the one he goes to Theresienstadt, right?
Yeah.
And
yeah.
And it had just been, incredible.
Yeah. I mean, just so every second of everything that they were doing was not just World War II, but it was all about the Holocaust at the same time.
You're getting into one of the other questions that came in was about were any members of the X Troop able to reunite with surviving family members? And you tell the story of this guy who drives across Europe to get to Czechoslovakia and get to Theresienstadt. But you talk about other examples too. And so is there a happy ending?
There is. It's a really optimistic book. That's the crazy thing. I didn't know it'd be so optimistic. There's a lot of happy endings in this book, but there's also like, it's interesting. I was thinking about Colin Anton, the guy I talked about earlier, whose dad was taken to Dachau, and he's one of the main men I focus on, particularly because he was in the Italian campaign, and I wanted to focus also on the Italian campaign. And after the war ends, like all of these guys, they're sent to do the denazification efforts, right? So they don't, the war ends for everybody else. It doesn't end for them. And he gets sent back to his hometown. And he goes and he finds his mom. His mom wasn't Jewish, right? And she was really abused because she had married his dad, who was Jewish. And she doesn't even recognize him when she first sees him. So he has this beautiful reunion with his mom. And then he thinks, look, I'm working for the government. I'm doing the denazification stuff. I'm going to find out who turned my dad in and had my dad murdered. And he goes to the local police, he gets information, he finds out who the person is who was directly responsible for his dad's death. And he has this moment that he talks about in the book where he says, I could take that guy to the woods and shoot him, but I'm not like that. And I think that means Jews, are not like that. We have higher ethics. And then he turned the guy into the police. So a lot of sort of how, it's not only sort of how they fought the war, that in my mind had this Jewish element, it was also their kind of ethical stance. And they really saw it very seriously that way, that they over and over again said, we are different from the Germans. And I think when they said we, it meant the Jews are different from the Germans because we do things in a much more ethical way.
This a question has come up, which is a kind of obvious question to kind of move towards wrapping up our conversation, which we need to do, which is, given what you describe and how you capture these amazing stories and these clearly significant role that this group of Jewish commandos played in the Allied victory during World War II, why isn't it more well known? Why don't we know this?
Well, we don't know it. I don't think it was, I think it was a combination of reasons. One is, like I said, these guys, they took on fake names and personas, right? Many of them didn't want to go there. So there was no kind of impetus from these guys themselves or their kids to get the story out. Though the truth is, when I started to interview all of the children, they were so excited that somebody was going to tell the story. But it had to do with that, these sort of fake personas that they had to all take on. Two is, this was really top secret. Like I had to declassify a lot of files to get at this story. So it was like this bit, it was super fun. Like I loved it, but it was it was hidden history that was just, if you just scratch below the surface, you'd start to see it. And 3 was because after the war, they spread out all over the world. So in order to write the book, I had to go to archives like in Australia, in America, in the UK, in Canada, like it was all over the place to get the story because of the fact that they never fought as their own unique unit. So, right. So if I was writing about Montford Gonz, I would need to get the war diaries of whichever commando unit he was put with. There is the one extra war diary, but to get the bigger story, I had to sort of go all over the place to get the full story. It wasn't just like writing about this cohesive commando unit. It was much more complicated. So I think that's why it hasn't been told. But the reception, particularly in the UK, has been phenomenal. And I'm very excited about like, oh my God, how did we not know this story before? Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I found it surprising. You know, the title is obviously of a commando unit, ex-troop, and yet when we get into the details, when you take us into the details, we learn that they're not fighting as a single unit. They're farmed out all over the place. And I'm just going to touch on one other of the amazing story, or what I found so amazing. There's I can't remember the name of the ex-trooper, but he, when they're getting into Germany, I think it is, you know, obviously the war for Germany, Germany is not doing well at that point,
right.
But he's kind of out of ammo, out of stuff, but he still manages to capture a whole unit of Germans and get them to surrender.
By like out talking them, like out brillianting them, like he gets an entire, and I have the photo there too, because it made its way through all these newsreels, because there's this guy sitting in a Jeep, a commando, who's Ian Harris, who's actually a German Jew, but that's his fake name is Ian Harris. And he talks an entire huge, massive unit into surrendering. It's crazy. And,
yeah, and the fact that you have the photo of him driving in the Jeep with these Germans marching behind, it's amazing that you were able to pull that together.
I just one last photo that I love to mention, because I hope people will get the book and see that there's another photo you see where there's this whole other story of the ex-troopers being very important in capturing the island of Walcheren, which is hugely crucial for the war effort. And there's this amazing photo of this ex-trooper who serves from Dieppe. They're in Dieppe too, but that's some
this other is near Antwerp, is that right?
Yeah, this is near Antwerp. So they have to get this island so they can secure Antwerp and get the stuff to the troops. And this one ex-trooper, Maurice Latimer, single-handedly gets this entire crucial German position to surrender. And there's this photo I have of him in the book with Maurice Latimer holding his Tommy gun raised, right, with these Germans or Nazis with their arms in the air walking like this. And what Peter Masters later said was it was the beautiful reversal of the archetypal Holocaust photo we all know of the little boy with his hands in the air with the Nazis. And here we have a Jewish commando holding the gun with the Nazis' hands in their air. So there you go.
Somebody's just asking, and I know you include the statistic in the book, of the 87 ex-troopers, how many survived the war? You said there's a high mortality rate.
Yeah, more than half of them were either killed or severely wounded or missing in action.
Yeah, and so I will say, just as a reader, you know, you don't tell all their stories, but you do tell us a number of stories, and we're kind of led into their lives, and then we learn that they were killed, and it's I mean, obviously that's war, and that's what happened. But
the 3 guys I focus on, what's really good about them is like they all survived, but they're also really crucial in denazification. And then they all have really interesting post-war lives too that I talk about. So like I always hated when I read history books when you go like, well, what happened like after 1945? So I have a full biography of every man I talk about, like 30 of them, sort of like this guy became, you know, like a famous artist, and this guy became a famous banker. So, you know, sort of how many kids they had, sort of what happened with their lives. And they all had really wonderful lives after the war, those who lived, who I focus on.
Well, I think we're going to wrap things up. Thank you so much for both writing this book, sharing this story, and coming and talking with us about it. And for those of you out there, it's as I hope you've gathered, really a gripping tale, and one that deserves to be more well known. So I hope you'll find a copy of the book and read through it and get into more of the detail than we've had tonight. But thank you, Professor Garrett.
Thank you so much
out there for joining us. And I look forward to seeing you all at some other programs soon. And Professor Garrett, I look forward to the next book.
Thank you. Me too.
All right. Have a good night, everybody.
Thank you.